I'm Marilyn Kouassi-Brou. Thank you for having me, and thank you for staying with me to the end of this day. I don't know how this works, but we'll go together. So I'll be talking about small molecule inhibitors targeting PAX3-FOXO1 oncoprotein for rhabdomyosarcoma. So as we've talked about throughout the course of today, rhabdomyosarcoma is the most common soft tissue malignant tumor in children and adolescents younger than 20. And although it can be diagnosed at any age, patients, more than 60% of patients are younger than 6. So there are two subtypes, which we've also talked about, embryonal and alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma. And of the two, alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma, it has a more aggressive disease pattern and a higher mortality rate. So the graph on the right shows the relative 5-year survival rate for the different types of rhabdomyosarcoma between 1976 and 2000. And as you can see, the mortality rate for the survival rate for alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma is lower than the other. And even now today, the 5-year survival rate is still less than 50%. Outcomes for high-risk rhabdomyosarcoma hasn't significantly improved in the last 30 years, and obviously there's an urgent need for novel therapies. The PAX3-FOXO1 fusion protein is specific to alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma, and it is the result of a translocation of chromosomes 2 and 13, as you can see. And this leads to the fusion of genes PAX3 and FOXO1. It actually fuses the binding domain, DNA binding domain of PAX3 with the transactivation domain of FOXO1. And this fusion is found in about 60% of ARMS tumors, and its presence and expression of the PAX3-FOXO1 fusion protein correlates with worse patient outcomes. So since PAX3-FOXO1 is only found in tumor cells, it is an ideal therapeutic candidate for treatment. And our goal is to find an inhibitor of PAX3-FOXO1 and to hope that this inhibitor can inhibit its oncogenic function. So the ways this can happen is that the inhibitor blocks PAX3-FOXO1 from binding to promoter and transcribing its target genes, or preventing PAX3-FOXO1 from interacting with its necessary protein partners. So this is our schematic experimental plan to identify a potential novel therapeutic agent. So our first step was to clone and purify PAX3-FOXO1 protein, and then use those purified samples in an initial screen to identify potential binders to PAX3-FOXO1. We did this with surface plasmon resonance, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then we used a secondary screen using a reporter assay in order to see the functional effects of these binders to PAX3-FOXO1. And then we hope to continue on with future experiments to confirm direct binding to the protein, and then to eventually find that not only does it bind to PAX3-FOXO1, but also functionally inhibits its function. So ideally, we hope to identify an inhibitor that does do that. So our first step was to obtain a pure sample of PAX3-FOXO1 to study further. And this was hard because this actually hadn't been done before. There wasn't a pure protein we could just buy, so we had to actually do it ourselves. And this is the Kouassi stain of the first successful purification that we did. And you can see here the uninduced, the induced version, and then the starting lysate after lysing the cells, and then the quite pure collected fractions that we got from affinity chromatography using a nickel column. So this was a very long process, but successful. So in order to find a compound that inhibits PAX3-FOXO1, we have to first find compounds that bind to it. So we use our purified protein samples in an initial screen using surface plasmon resonance, and this is a schematic of that. So we immobilize our protein on this microchip, which is this is the protein. And then we screened a series of small molecule libraries through a flow channel one by one to test their binding to our protein. And the way, this is a general version, but the way this works is that there's light shown through a prism, bounces off the microchip, and then is reflected back. And if there's a binding event, the reflectivity curve is shifted, and it allows us to see a binding affinity for each compound to PAX3-FOXO1. So this is the result of that screen. Each of these dots is one of the compounds that we tested. and on the y-axis is the relative binding compared to our negative controls that we used. So the blue line represents the threshold that we set for narrowing down the compounds, and we decided to choose compounds that bound to paxifoxo-1 5-fold or higher compared to our negative controls. So for the first screen, we actually did it at 1 concentration, but then we went back with a few of the compounds to test them again at different concentrations to see if there's a dose-dependent binding response. So we tested in triplicate at these concentrations to see the effect, and if I can... okay, so each of these is the concentration. I don't think it's working. Okay. So we injected it here, and then this is the binding response, and then we stopped injecting. This is just buffer, so washing away the compound. That's why it falls off. And this is the negative control that we use, and this is just background noise from the injection, and then there is no binding here. So we wanted to see that, as you can see, there is a stronger response as we increase the concentration of the compound, and that there is a specific response because there is no binding to our negative controls, as you can see there. And this allows us to see the binding affinity for each compound. And from that allowed us to go from about 3,800 compounds to 119 potential binders from this screen. So although a compound binds to paxifoxo-1, it may not affect its function, or it may be too toxic, or it may affect transcription non-specifically. So we needed to find a way to screen them to see which ones actually had a functional effect on paxifoxo-1. So we use a luciferase assay where we use a promoter construct that was responsive to paxifoxo-1 and then fuse that with the luciferase gene. So we were able to monitor, to evaluate paxifoxo-1 activity by monitoring the luciferase expression, which we can do through a light signal. And the idea there is if the inhibitor binds to paxifoxo-1 and prevents it from binding to the promoter, then there will be a lower signal to look at. So from there, we looked at the ability of the inhibitors to, well, of the molecules to inhibit Pax3 responsive luciferase activity in an ARMS cell line. We used RH30. Specifically so that it did not also inhibit luciferase activity in our renal carcinoma negative control. And so we looked at compounds that reduced paxifoxo-1 activity by more than 60%, and then did not reduce activity in the renal carcinoma. So this brought us from 119 potential binders to 10 primary hits that we are looking at. So this is the schematic that I showed before, and this is where we're at on what we have done so far. And we're moving on to steps 4 and 5. We're currently doing experiments for those. So we want to confirm binding to paxifoxo-1 in different systems, not just the BioCore, because there are drawbacks to that too. One of those ways is ITC, which is isothermal titration calorimetry, and this allows us to look at binding, to confirm binding by looking at the heat change that happens when there's a binding event. So that will allow us to see the thermodynamics for each binding event and also get another binding affinity, which we can confirm with the BioCore. And then we also want to do cellular thermal shift assay because ITC and BioCore both use recombinant purified protein. So we want to also test that these molecules bind to endogenous paxifoxo-1. So we want to use these compounds in a ARMS cell line to test that. So the way that works is by looking at the thermal stability of the protein and then comparing it to the thermal stability of the protein after it binds to a compound. After that, we want to make sure that the compounds are also functionally inhibiting paxifoxo-1, and we want to do that with qPCR. So paxifoxo-1 is a transcription factor, so it will affect the transcription of certain target genes. So we want to look at the expression of those genes with qPCR. And then studies have also shown that inhibition of paxifoxo-1 sensitizes ARMS cell lines to vincristine, so we want to also do testing in ARMS cell lines, looking at both combination of vincristine and each of the compounds to see if there is a synergistic effect. And then in the future, we would also like to proceed, if we identify a novel therapeutic agent or more than one ideally, we want to study them in vivo in animal studies and also potentially clinical trials in the future. And clinical trials are actually more realistic than you would think because 7 of the 10 primary hits that we're looking at now are actually already FDA approved. so that they could be repurposed for something else. So we hope by going through this plan to find a compound that does inhibit paxifloxacin activity, and that that could be a potential novel therapy for alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma. And this might not necessarily directly lead to a cure, of course, but we hope that it could be used in combination with chemotherapy or radiotherapy for improving outcomes for these patients. Thank you. This is my lab. I'd like to thank Dr. Ren, who is my PI, and all the other lab members, especially Peru and Elise, who did the BioCore screen.